You may have experienced that feeling you get of fear, which paralyzes you before you start to pursue or do something, as you may end up overthinking. I know when I was in primary school, I was a huge overthinker. I would overthink about every little detail of scenario of everything. And it really would paralyze me in decision making. And it took me some time to get better at this, especially when you think about second order consequences. I think that's something that I did at a very young age. I was always considering not just the immediate consequences, but also the consequences after and the consequences after. And you can fall into this trap of paralysis. Whether it's, getting sent to the hospital if you start doing boxing or something, or a plane crashing, etc. It's just important that we assess the potential consequences of an action rationally, and we also control our fears, that we temper it. And to do this, we need to think about the probabilities of it even occurring in the first place. One of the keys to becoming better at probabilistic thinking, they call it, is to understand an approach called Bayesian Updating, which sounds very nerdy and weird and everything, but the basic idea is that we already have information about the world. So when we encounter new information, we should assess it in the light of our prior information before we reach a certain conclusion. For example, say you go on social media and you see news with a headline of violent crimes are skyrocketing. And so what do? You immediately start to panic and you build stress, and you probably buy weapons or something to prepare for a theft or some sort of purge or something that happens. And you never want to leave the house again. However, this won't affect you as much if you're a Bayesian thinker. You recall that violent crimes have been essentially declining for the last decades. As a result, even if crimes had doubled this past year, it could have just moved from 0.01% to 0.02%. That means then 2 in every 10,000 were now victims of violent crime. And it would be unfortunate for the victims that do encounter violent crime, but your chances of experiencing this or being a victim is extremely slim. However, this doesn't mean we should just dismiss new information whilst holding on to the old for anything. The world changes, and so we need to update our understanding of it accordingly so we can have more control over our lives. It's just like when you have an operating system, when you're on the phone, when you have apps or anything, you should also update it to the latest software as well. Hence, the headline about violent crime skyrocketing should only diminish your belief that the crime rate is still extremely low, and if the crime rate is low, and if true, then it's basically telling you then that the rate has just increased by a little tiny bit higher than you thought it was. So you should adjust your belief a tiny bit as well relative to the news. But if the rate, say, continues to rise and read the same headline over and over again everywhere you go, social media, etc., everyone's talking about it, then you'd need to replace that prior belief that maybe the crime is now actually high, and you need to be more careful in that case. And I also want to make a point that there's something also known as crowd psychology, like something where when everyone starts to believe something, be also someone who looks at it from a different angle and different perspective, or alternative perspective as well. And I'm not really talking about statistics in that case, because statistics majority of the time is quite factual if you do a lot of research. But I'm talking about when it's dealing with things like panic, the crowd psychology. Like I've seen it in 2021 when we saw Bitcoin skyrocket to 69,000. Quite a funny number. When it skyrocketed to that number, everyone was talking about it, even your grandma, grandpa, whoever, like some 10-year-old who play Roblox. What? Like if everyone's in it, then who's gonna buy this, right? So it's at a top. The people that were in it years ago are just gonna be selling and dumping. So you need to have this mindset that when there's crowd psychology happening, where this crowd is panicking and they're all believing in something, there is an edge case in that, and you need to identify that, because that's something like I even experienced this myself when I was on a train. There was some announcements, some delays were happening. The train that was on board so many people were on board, and then there was like an announcement saying like, oh, it's not going to stop at XYZ, and people like, as soon as several people started going out, and I already knew where the stops were, I didn't really feed into this fear or panic or something. And then there were so many people that went outside, and the doors literally closed, and they realized at that moment that they were supposed to be on the train, but because they followed the crowd, they ended up being in a situation that they shouldn't have been in the first place if they just rationally sat down and thought about it rather than just following the crowd blindly. That's the key word, following the crowd blindly. So that's just something that I wanted to note. But anyways, moving on, an action step I recommend is write down your fears and pick one of the ones that you fear the most. For example, I had a fear of doing content creation for some time, and even my personality is all expressing that. I've lately been trying to become more real and expressive of my personality, more authentic. And I kept procrastinating this, and I actually might have seemed more robotic in my older videos. So only until I really assessed and quantified the probability of negative outcomes from happening versus the positive, and I was able to find that the positive just outweighs the negative by tenfolds. And in a way, this erased all these fears that I had. They all became like these illusions. As I understood that negative comments and all these situations that you come across are inevitable, but only really take a small, tiny percentage of your entire overall life. And criticism is part of the process because it's going to, at the end of the day, provide value because you'll actually help improve your quality of content and bring the best version of you, actually. As long as you're being authentic and it aligns with your interests and values, that's what matters, I think, the most. And even if you do a single mistake, it will be a lot less significant than you originally had believed it to be. Not everything will be perfect at the beginning, and this is something that took me some time to accept. Because I would go on YouTube and I see all these guys have like light set up, they have like this $10,000 camera and this whole studio setup and stuff, and I'm like, but then I watched the older videos they started 5-10 years ago, and it's just like some guy with a Nokia phone. They just recorded and started talking, and that's how it, everyone starts somewhere. No one is perfect at the beginning, but you start to develop. As long as you're authentic with your identity, which is, I think, is very important, you always improve. And you shouldn't go off the expectation of perfection. Just pursue excellence. Always find ways to improve. Thus Kaizen, which is a Japanese concept of always improving or continuous improvement. So if you liked and enjoyed this video, then like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next part of the mental model and critical thinking series.